Real Rukshan, thank you so much for visiting New Zealand and working so hard to bring a light to what's been going on here. I know you've been doing a lot of work over in Melbourne, but how did you even get into the role of independent media? Where did this begin for you?
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Chantal, and it's great to be here in New Zealand. Look, for me, a lot of this, what I'm doing, has been instigated by what's happened in Melbourne during our lockdowns and I guess all the things that went down during the pandemic. So myself, I'm a business owner, so I work in the wedding industry. And a lot of people make fun of me for being a wedding photographer now / journalist, but that's something that I love to do, and I've been doing that for about 10 years. But the wedding industry was hit really hard during the lockdowns in Melbourne. We're usually the first industry to be shut down, and usually the last to open during our rolling lockdowns, because weddings is where people get together. Families come from all around the country, for instance, and gather, and that's one thing the government likes to shut down first, because that would, according to them, fix problems. So having that time at home really allowed me to kind of explore other parts of my life that I've had interest in, which is one part is politics. So it really allowed me to focus on that and kind of go out there and start making content about issues that were close to me.
You're in Melbourne and famously have Dan Andrews as a premier, who was notoriously tyrannical with some of the decisions he made.
Yeah.
What were some of the hardest parts of those decisions? Like, where did it really hit home for you that this has gone too far?
Look, you'll find a lot of people in Victoria, in Melbourne, and all across Australia, and it's probably the same in New Zealand. Most people are happy to kind of, have that community sense and do what needs to be done for the community and go along with what their politicians and governments tell them to do. I think what really hit a sore point in Melbourne, myself and for many others, when we saw that there wasn't accountability for a lot of the decisions that were being made. There wasn't transparency about why these decisions were being made. For instance, famously in Melbourne, there was a time when you could go to a brothel, but you couldn't go to a nightclub. Like, why these kind of things were being done and what predicated these decisions weren't really made clear to the public. And, we had a lot of issues where government, it was obvious they made mistakes, but they were not willing to front up to the public. And a lot of the businesses, like my business and many other businesses, had to bear the brunt of these decisions, but we had politicians who, just walked away from it. So I think that's what kind of became a sore point initially.
There were some scenes here that shocked a lot of Kiwis, including the drone that would follow people in the park in Melbourne. Did you see anything like that in the city? Yeah,
so I didn't personally see these kind of drones and stuff, but there was a lot of those things kind of going on. I think the government and the police, they got kind of very, creative in a very authoritarian way.
Yeah.
It's like looking at the textbooks from the CCP or something and thinking, oh, which things can we try out on the people to manage this? And
is that where you think they got some of these ideas from, the CCP, or where do you think some of the...
Yeah, I say it jokingly, but a lot of the things that we saw were very authoritarian, were things that we've never seen in kind of our free societies that were happening in our countries, right? I think that's what shocked a lot of people, the way in which these things were introduced. Like, it was just like, hey, we've got to start doing this now, we've got to start doing drone surveillance. You've got to accept it because that's the way it is now. And I think the fact that they were just thrown onto people without that consultation, without giving the reasoning for it properly, that was the issue.
In a political sense, how do the premiers work? Is it kind of like a council for that state?
Yeah, so because the way the structure of Australia is set up, we have the different states. So Daniel Andrews would probably be similar to Jacinda Ardern here, but she's just running the whole of New Zealand, where Daniel Andrews is responsible for Victoria. But again, Victoria is a big state. But then we had other states who had different rules to us. So we had in our country, from state to state, the rules were different. So, a lot of people would ask, what's that science based on? Like, is it consistent throughout the country? So we did have this thing where the federal government kind of put together a national cabinet, and all the premiers would meet up and try to have some sort of consensus in terms of the rules that they would implement. But even with that, you did see a lot of fracturing around, who was responsible for what. Federal law, does it override, state law, a lot of these issues. And I think we really got to see how much power is concentrated in the Premier of Victoria. And people that weren't exposed to politics before might have never known who Daniel Andrews was in Victoria, because that's kind of the laid back culture in Victoria. But now everyone knows what
Looking
Premier
back,
is.
who was the best premier of which state? Like which state did it right or did it the best?
Oh, look, if you ask any of the people from different states in Australia, they would tell you their premier is pretty bad.
Yeah.
So there wasn't anyone that got it like right or perfect, because we did have that kind of federal overarching response as well. There was, Victoria's probably the most hard-hit state, followed by, I think, Queensland, and then maybe New South Wales. And of course, Western Australia is a bit crazy as well, that they're kind of telling us to put faith in what we're doing. This is the best that we think is going to turn out. But after a while, we saw that that wasn't really the case, right? So being humans and wanting to know, right? It's hard for us not to have those answers answered. I think that's what really prepped me to kind of go out there and see, because, the narrative from the politicians was being backed up by the narrative from our media, by the mainstream media. And they weren't asking the most fundamental basic questions. But if you went down and you spoke to your friends back then
what
on...
are some of those questions?
Oh, look, I'm just saying in general, like any fundamental questions, like you could see that there was a disconnect between what people were experiencing at home. Like, for instance, the issues that people were having during lockdowns with, mental health issues, or, people being told that they can't, go out of a certain radius around their house and all these things. Then those were issues that people were talking about in the public, but within the media itself, they were brushing over those things. And it was always about this kind of pushing government narratives and pushing the propaganda and fear. And I think when you had a general conversation with a friend on a Zoom call back then, or at a park or something, you'd be kind of on the same page, but it wasn't being represented in the media.
What is it like with independent media in Australia and even in Melbourne? Is there much independent media? How many people seem to follow them?
Yeah.
Or is it very much based on the mainstream narrative?
Oh, look, there is a lot of independent media in Australia, particularly in Melbourne, and a lot of it arose during these kind of testing and trying times.
What is your reason for not wearing a mask?
Because I'm doing my job as media.
Could someone grab his name and address?
I think the public there is open to independent media. They're happy to consume independent media. And it's not so much in the sense that, oh, this is like the single source of truth. It's more so, it's a different perspective, right? And, for me, I found that during my time covering these issues, people were just tuning into what I was doing because it was just like they weren't seeing it anywhere else. You know what I mean? They weren't seeing it anywhere else. And that in itself is shocking, because it's not too hard for these companies in Australia, or these media stations, like our government runs ABC, for instance. They have massive budgets, and for them to not go out there and actually cover issues like people who are angry about lockdowns or whatever it is, like, it's just I think it's unbecoming of what they should be when they're representing the people as a media organization.
Why do you think it's so important to have independent media?
Again, in these times, we see that the power of the state, the power of corporations, is particularly when they get around a rallying point, and they tell you that this is the way that things are going to be. It shows you how disastrous it can be, because having that independent perspective, hearing people's opinions, hearing people's voices, helps us inform the way that decisions should be made. So if we had more information coming out from other experts or other doctors, which was very seriously censored during these times, it might have changed the course of the trajectory of the decisions that were made. But instead, businesses and stuff had to suffer because we were only getting a single source of information.
What did some of the censorship around the doctors and scientists over there look like? How did they censor them?
Look, mainly the mainstream media would not, I guess, show any of the interviews, wouldn't interview people like this, right? They would only interview people who were coming from the state, who were authorized, or who were on song with a certain message. Like whenever someone came on, it was so-and-so doctor from, and they're also a special envoy to the WHO or something. You know what I mean? Like, it's this kind of same group of people almost. Sure, they're professionals in their own right, and they're very learned and they know what they're talking about. But we're hearing from these other experts who are sometimes leading in their field from different parts of the world. And why is their view not being shown to us? Like, what are they trying to tell us? Like, we can't make up our own minds. So that's the issue there.
We had a very similar thing here where they had about 5 TV experts, and I call them TV experts because they'd come out, they'd be on the TV, but they never actually treated the virus. They didn't actually have patients that they were treating at that time, and I found that unusual, that you were bringing in experts but they hadn't actually dealt with the patients. Whereas when we had other doctors who had dealt with thousands of patients and they were saying, hey, there are treatments, this is what they look like, they weren't even allowed to be heard, and people were pretending that the only option that we had here was to wait for a jab, and that to me sent conflicting messages. How wide was that group of experts that they used over in Melbourne?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty repetitive experts. I mean, these guys, they had a good thing going. A lot of TV appearances. I don't know about money, but it was good for their, their brand, I guess. They had a lot of exposure to the public. Some of them, became like, even our chief health officer in Melbourne, Brett Sutton, they became like household symbols, you know what I mean? Like, which is fine, but when you start seeing the same people, like there's not that, they're not going to check themselves. Even if they, like I saw experts that were saying one thing at the start, and then they were saying something else a few months down the track, but they weren't really being held accountable by the people that were interviewing them for the things they said before. And, a serious question would have been like, hey, what you said, this would do this, 3 months ago. That never happened. So how can we trust what you're saying now? Just very basic questions, but they were allowed a pass.
Well, what they say is the science has changed, don't they?
Yeah.
However, I think the people that have been very independent of government and put forward independent advice, the science seems to actually validate what those people said at the beginning, and now we're 2 years on, and it's still the same advice, and it's still, and it seems now the advice from the TV experts is changing to more reflect what these independent experts have been saying the whole time. So I find the whole science changes. Absolutely it does. And as we get more knowledge, things do evolve. However, if you can see these independent ones had the same advice at the beginning as they do now, and now everyone's starting to follow that, surely you should start to question what we label an expert.
Yes, you're right. You're right. But what I'm finding now is that those same experts that were maybe right at the beginning, they're still being maligned, because there is this hesitancy now for governments and for health institutions and stuff to not admit to the faults that they made. It's almost like a cover-up. It's almost like, hey, forget the past. Don't worry about all the things we said. What we're saying now is right. Don't worry about the people back then that were correct. Don't worry about them. They're still wrong. They're still wrong today. That's what's happening. And you're finding that if you try to go correct the record now with those same experts, people will still turn up and say, oh, but they can't be trusted, those people, and they actually have the track record to prove that they were kind of right at the start, right? So it's crazy how it's all being manipulated, and there is a lot that's gone into doing that, I think.
How did you see New Zealand? Because being over in Melbourne, I'm sure you would have just seen news and things of what was going on here. What was your perception of New Zealand before you arrived?
Yeah, in terms of the pandemic,
I guess. In terms of the pandemic, COVID response.
So a lot of portrayal of New Zealand at the start was kind of like a model country, a model state, sorry, not state, country, a model, prime minister doing what needs to be done for her citizens, and a leading example to the world. And I think a lot of ways it was heralded as like a model that maybe should be followed elsewhere as well. I'm not saying that was always a narrative that was shown in Australia, but it was a very positive New Zealand. We could see the early stages of what we had gone through transpiring here. And would that be a correct kind of way to look at things?
Yeah, I would definitely say we were further behind you guys. And I noticed, like, obviously we had a protest in February that lasted 23 days in Wellington at our parliament, which was a huge moment for New Zealand, because New Zealand is we're very compliant because we're quite relaxed people. We don't really like to get upset at anyone. We don't like arguments. We always say we're just really chill. It's Kiwis. We're just chill. We just want to have a beer and relax and just go to work, come home, not worry about stuff. So for Kiwis to get mad enough that they physically camped at Parliament, that was huge. That was a massive defining moment for our country, I believe, and for I guess what was on the hearts of the citizens. It was really big, but then the police came in and they were violent towards people. The people would react back, and I mean, I can understand from the police's perspective, they're given instructions of what to do and they follow them, but from my perspective, I'm always about the people. And I was saying, if you just said to the government, you actually have to come out and at least have a conversation before we go and do this to the people, everything would have been settled. And so, I struggled watching all of that and watching the violence, but I'd seen Melbourne, 6 months earlier, have quite violent protests where you saw old ladies getting pushed over, assaulted, and lots of the rubber bullets fired at them. When was the first violent protest, like that the police were violent against the people in Melbourne? How long ago was that?
Yeah, look, you'll find like there was a gradual descent into the extreme kind of violence we saw in Melbourne towards the end, but consistently throughout most of the protests, the interactions between the public and the police were not good, and the portrayal of protesters from the very onset was very negative by the media. It seemed very deliberate, and that's one of the actual reasons that I actually started going out to actually cover these issues, because what I was watching on the television and what I was seeing people talking about on the streets while protesting, it didn't match the way that it was being portrayed. And until you actually go out there and you're amongst the protesters, that's when I first kind of realized, hey, they're just like me. They're just ordinary Australians, ordinary Victorians, and they're out here because they're frustrated with their government. And as it built up, the police response also built up, and that's when you would have seen a lot of the more kind of violent interactions between members of the public and the police. We didn't really have any kind of sit-ins as such as you had at your parliament because of how large Australia is. But those moments there during those protests when I would see the police pulling out weapons, for instance, and then firing rubber bullets and these kind of things, I never thought I would see in Australia. I never thought I would ever see that in Melbourne. And I come from a background where, I come from South Asia. My parents are originally from Sri Lanka. And if someone was to tell me that would happen in Sri Lanka, I'd be like, yeah, of course. It's going to happen there, because those things have happened historically. When politicians want to shut the public down, they'll do things like this, even using live rounds. In Australia, though, I thought, nah, they're not going to fire on people because they're protesting against the government about lockdowns. I mean, everyone's in this together, supposedly. But the fact that the police did turn around and do that, it really showed you that things had escalated to such a level, people's frustration had built up to such a level that the only way politicians could think of dealing with that was to shoot on people. And that really shows a lack of leadership. And I blame government for that, not the people.
Were people quite shocked when they watched that back home, or was the general public on board with the mainstream media messaging of all protesters are bad and they should be vilified?
No, I think there was a moment where most people were shocked. But you saw the government and the media and the authorities kind of come together to try to see how we can switch this all around, paint this in a negative light. And there is a lot of work that they do to kind of make sure that people feel that it's because of these people that things are prolonged. It's because of these people that things are the way they are. And the reality is, the reason that we have mandates or lockdowns or whatever it is usually because of mistakes made by governments. But it's easy for them to look at, show a group of people protesting and say, hey, look, these people aren't following the rules, blame them. And
they use a lot of slur terms against protesters here in New Zealand. What are some of the slur terms that they use over in Australia to try and define and categorise the protesters?
Yeah, I mean, look, everyone's called anti-vaxxer, conspiracy theorist, cooker. That's a new term that they use.
What is that?
A cooker, yeah.
What is that?
I don't know. They call it cooker, like they're cooked in the head, so that's why they're out there.
Lovely.
So like, yeah.
Lovely's just being kind.
Yeah, it's very derogatory, the terms that they use to describe people, and that's what I find shocking because, for a lot of the protests, especially the larger protests that I attended, these were like people from all backgrounds, young, old, different parts of Australia, different ethnic backgrounds. And they were there because, not really even because of vaccines and stuff like this, they were there because their businesses were hurting. They were at the brink of losing, something that they've put their life into. They couldn't see their families, or they had families stuck overseas, all these kind of issues, right? So the portrayal of it as just conspiracy theorists who don't want to take a vaccine and they're all anti-vaxxers because of all this stuff is just nonsense. I mean, the anti-vax thing didn't really come into the Melbourne protest debates as such until it was mandated. That's when you saw a lot more people speaking up against their desire not to be forced into doing something. The original kind of protest really I saw was more so around the fact that they weren't happy with the lockdowns, you know what I mean? So it's a mix of things, and I think the portrayal is just this cartoonish portrayal of people as agitators, and they just hate the government because they're anti-vax or something like this is nonsense.
It's funny, isn't it? I mean, I've had that said about me, and I actually was going to go get the vaccine, but then they mandated it, and I was like, I was always like, I'm just going to wait and see if there's like more side effects than people know about. Then they mandated it, and I was like, oh no.
Yeah.
Just purely on an ethical basis. I was like, no, you can't force people into doing that.
Yeah.
And I can't imagine the hurt people carry when they were forced into doing something and having something put in their body that they weren't comfortable with.
Yeah.
But for a lot of the people I spoke with at the protest here, a lot of them were actually double jabbed or even triple, but they were just saying we just don't agree with the mandates.
Yeah.
And so they keep changing the terminology to just kind of suit how they want to present people.
That's right.
But here they love the white supremacy argument. It's everyone is a white supremacist if you
Yeah.
don't agree with the government, no matter what the colour of their skin is.
Yeah.
And that's a funny one that I think about a lot,
Well,
because I think, when on earth can you call someone, like, you know, if you've got a room of 10 people and they're all completely ethnically diverse and they've got a common goal against the mandates, how can you validate calling that group racist?
Yeah, I mean, it's nonsense, that whole angle that was taken, and that's, a lot of it's pushed by, I would say, the extreme far left and their work way of looking at certain things, that, oh, this is racism, that's why they're out there, they're racist. And these people, even though they look like, you know, they shouldn't be racist because they're, you know, ethnics or something from a different country, but they've been like fooled by the white person to go out there.
It's exactly,
it's
word for word what they said in this documentary thing they put out.
Yeah,
and I'm like, how insulting is that? Or how racist is that?
It's very insulting. Like, even for myself, I'm called a you know, even your newspaper here called me a far right activist or far right agitator, or, you know, almost like saying a white supremacist type thing, right? And it's ridiculous because we're not that. And you will find a lot of the resistance in Australia to mandates and a lot of this nonsense that the government were doing was coming from the migrant communities, was coming from the ethnic communities, because they don't put up with this type of thing, even with their governments. Sure, the consequences are different in their countries, but you know, generally our communities don't put up with this kind of forced type of thing.
Do you think it's because they've seen governments overstep and overreach before, and New Zealand hasn't really seen any of that, and Aussie to an extent hasn't really seen that either, so maybe it's the first time that Western cultures are going, oh wow, this is a problem. Yeah,
sure, definitely. Like, a lot of the protesters in Melbourne were from Eastern Europe. They had backgrounds where they had seen this type of encroachment on their lives from governments, and that's why they were there, because they didn't want to see that happening. And a lot of people that have already seen this in other parts of the world, they already know the signs of it. They already know kind of what it looks like and what it feels like. And I think there's this naivety amongst Western nations, New Zealand and Australia being amongst them, where they believe that they are somehow above all that, that their governments would never do these kind of things to them, and they would never act not in their best interests. And look, part of me, I still believe that's the case. These are wonderful countries we live in. New Zealand, Australia, they're amazing places when you compare it to the rest of the world. But we are seeing a tendency now for our governments to go down that path where they stop respecting certain norms that we have, certain standards that we live by, you know, whether it's the Constitution or, you know, whether it's just basic understanding of human rights. We're seeing more and more governments in the West ignore those things. And I think the pandemic has really brought that to light, just how far they can go. And I think that's why people are concerned. Like, even, you know, your average person will look at this now and be like, actually, yeah, we can turn out like, you know, that country that's not that great.
The protest that you attended here, there was an anti-protest protest that went on with a group of local Antifa people.
Yeah.
What was your perception of that? Have you guys seen that in Australia as well? The
Yes.
anti-protest protests? And how was that experience for you?
Yeah, look, it's very interesting watching these anti-fascist groups. And look, they have a right to protest and they have a right to say and do whatever they want to do. I respect them, their ability to do that. But it's very interesting that a lot of these groups take on the side of, a lot of the times, the same governments that they disagree with on other issues, you know. But for this particular issue, because for whatever reason, it's like the government is correct, listen to the government, listen to the corporations, listen to Big Pharma, because we're on their side for this issue. And if you ask them on other topics related to this, they will say, oh no, we can't trust the government. The government's doing this, this and this to people. It's systemic racism, it's systemic this. But then if you believe in all these things, why can't you believe that maybe the system is also, in this particular issue, working against the people? So really, it's more of something that they've chosen to get behind because they believe there's a, you know, far right or white supremacist boogeyman that's making people, you know, not want to wear masks or disagree with mandates or something. You know? They fully believe it's something to do with racism, and it's bizarre. And one of the things I saw yesterday, which is the same thing I've seen in Australia, is a lot of these Antifa groups compared to the other protesters, are mostly made up of very young, you know, for lack of a better description, white. No, white, uni student types, and people who maybe have, you know, the very thing they speak about, privilege. And what I saw about in the protest groups, and I'm very new to New Zealand, but I saw a lot more people who looked indigenous to New Zealand, and a lot more diversity, a lot more people who were of you know, different backgrounds, families, a lot more children. Whereas with the other group that was saying that these people are racist and white supremacists, it was mostly just, you know, people, you know, young white people telling people, you know, like, oh, your life is great, listen to the government. It's just crazy. And I think, look, the media kind of doesn't do enough in terms of asking those groups questions, asking them why they believe these things. It's very easy for them just to be like, oh, well, they agree with the government this time, so let's just leave it at that.
Have you tried to talk with those groups before? Have you been successful in trying to talk to them before?
No, so I have tried to cover one of their protests in Melbourne, and they are very, that was also an anti-racism protest, and they're very hostile. So even...
What do you mean by hostile? Like, what happened?
Oh, like they would literally want to attack you type thing. You know, I'm like on a hit list for them. Even coming here, I would see these groups sharing information about me, saying, watch out for this person, don't talk to this person. And, you know, for groups that talk about, you know, being anti-racist and all these kind of things, when in the Melbourne protests, I went up to them and said, look, you guys are talking about anti-racism. I'm a reporter from, like, you know, a different background. You know, I'm not white. Tell me, like, why you guys are protesting. And you know, it's not about that. It's more about ideology. It's not about race for these groups. If you don't agree with them, it doesn't matter what you look like, where you're from. You're like I don't think there's almost no point talking to them, but I still think it's important to try, but I would say there's no point because they're very hard set in their ways.
Yeah, I've tried to talk to them as well, and I always invite people on for a conversation because obviously I find that they do that. They share things in groups and then they go out and like group trolls and try and like get your content shut down, or they just try and say horrible things that are really untrue, but they'll do it in like a massive group of them.
Yes.
And so I'm always like, I'm not going to tolerate abuse, but come and have a conversation. Yep. You know, like if you disagree with me, come and have a conversation. Like, here's the email address, let's set up an interview. Let's just, anytime we can go live so you know it won't be edited, just actually make that step to be bold. And if that's what you truly believe, back it with thought and back it with a process, but they just won't. Besides
some of the leaders of these groups, they don't really believe in what they're doing up there. A lot of the people that are up there, the young ones, they have no idea about the real world.
Do you think it's more group thought then?
Group thought, and they just feel like there is a boogeyman and they've been indoctrinated in such a way that they believe that's the case. I think that's the only way that they can then look at a protest where there's a large majority of people who are indigenous to New Zealand and say that they're, you know, far-right Nazis or, you know, white supremacists and stuff. I think that's the only way that you can become like that, because they don't understand the world. They don't understand that even in countries where everyone, you know, looks like me, even in Sri Lanka, for instance, people would argue about things like lockdowns and mandates. It's a very human issue. So it's not about race. The fact they try to bring race into it and all these other things into it, it shows you that they don't understand the issue. And even if they did understand the issue, they want to muddy the waters because they want to feed into a certain narrative.
You came over here, we were meant to be coming here with Avi Yemini, who's a friend of yours and a fellow reporter at Rebel News. Why do you think New Zealand didn't want to let him into the country?
Look, I think there was a bit of a build-up with that article from the NZ Herald. I would call it a sensational hit piece, where they kind of take things that are out there in the open, but then they sensationalize it and, you know, add their own flavouring to it to try to get a response from government. And I think that kind of put Avi and myself on some sort of list or some sort of block or something like this, right? And so unfortunately, Avi Yemini was unable to come through the airport. And, you know, I had the same issue at the airport where when my passport was scanned initially, it was blocked by NZ Immigration. And the staff, the Qantas staff, were telling me they'd never seen this kind of block before on an Australian passport.
And is there any reason why they would block you? Is there anything in your past, anything like that?
No, nothing in my past. Yeah, there's nothing. There's no reason besides maybe what they saw in that article, which blows my mind again, because this is a liberal democracy, New Zealand. It's meant to be. And to think that they would not be open to having the outside world critique them, particularly from a journalistic perspective, and then, you know, take the word of some newspaper article and use that as a reason to stop someone's, visa or whatever it is, whatever. I don't even think I need a visa to come from Australia with an Australian passport.
No.
You just kind of come and you can work and do these things, right? But to think that that would motivate them to kind of do these things, it's very childish in a way. Like it's very, I hate to use this word, but it's very pathetic on the part of NZ immigration, because it shows a lack of, it's just immaturity in a way. If this happened when I was going to like China, for instance, or I was going to like Iran or Taliban controlled Afghanistan, I'd be like, yes, I expect that to happen. But to see the New Zealand government kind of cave in that way and do these kind of weird things, it shows you that, there are influences within these organizations, whether it's NZ immigration or the government, whatever it is, where they take to heart what's being said in the newspapers.
Yeah.
The PR that, the certain PR around certain things, like all these things matter to them, when really that shouldn't be their main focus. They have other things to do, other actual real, criminals and real issues to deal with. But they're getting caught up in these type of issues, which shows you even a small group of these kind of anti-fascist people that were really pushing these stories and pushing these people to stop us from coming have influence, and it shouldn't be that way.
Do you think what you're doing and what people like me are doing is making a difference in the world?
Difference as in, I think it's difference, I would say it's needed in the world. Difference is hard to really, give give an explanation for that, but I think it's needed. You'll find that, in any country where there's some sort of issue, there are groups and people that speak out, and it's very important. I'm seeing right now in Afghanistan, that's under the control of the Taliban, you're seeing their protests here and there pop up by women because they're being restricted again, right? Their rights are being restricted. Now, if those women, for instance, used a platform like Facebook to spread their message, we would applaud that. In the West, we would say, oh, bravo, good for them, right? But they're going against the law of the Taliban right now. They're going against the law of the country, right? But we are saying, no, they need to do that. But in our own countries, in New Zealand or in Australia, when independent media, when people that have a different perspective to the government want to speak out, these same organizations will shut those people down. And that shows you just how far, the West is morally bankrupt, because it can criticize the rest of the world. But once you start looking internally, they don't want to hear it. They don't want to see it. And they'll use the very tools that they tell you will help spread freedom and all these messages around the world against the people in their own countries. So it's a shame.
Last question, what would be your one piece of advice for someone that would love to be a real Rukshan back in their country or even here? What would your piece of advice be? Yeah,
look, I think for people in terms of advice, I think you can just go do it, right? I didn't
take
go.
Nike slogan.
Yeah, take the Nike slogan. Yeah, but at the end of the day, I didn't start doing this in a way that I want people following me, and I didn't do that for those reasons, and I think I still don't do it for those reasons. If you have a passion about something, whatever it is, and you want to go out there and do this, we live in a world today where we have that ability. Access to media in terms of social media makes that possible, of course, but also access to technology, cameras, our phone. There's I'm going to plug a documentary here, but there's an amazing documentary that you can probably watch. It's called Writing with Fire, and it's about these journalists in India, from the lowest caste in India, these women journalists, and just about how they're going out with their phones and recording stuff around them and like reporting these stories, right? These women can't speak, they've never used a phone before, you know what I mean? But people can go out there and do that, and it's making a difference in their communities. So if people try to push back and hold you down and tell you, like they tell me, Rukshan, you're just a wedding photographer, stick in your lane, I think that's the wrong way of looking at these things. If you want to go out there and do independent reporting, creating content, do these things, I think we should all, believe in ourselves that we can do that. And you'll find that people are out there that will support you. People are out there that are looking for your content. And I think that's why they're, maybe shutting people down. That might be why they may be shutting your Facebook down. And even me for Facebook, I don't think I'll be there on much longer as well. So that's kind of the way things are going, right? So, but yeah, regardless of that, don't back down, and we have to keep going.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. I always double down. That's what I say. I say if they push back on you, double down. Don't cave in. You've got to double down, because or else no one will have a voice. If everyone caves, no one has a voice.
100%.
Well, thank you so much.
No
I
worries.
love chatting to you, and thank you for coming here, and thank you for caring about New Zealand, because I know it means a lot to me, and it does mean a lot to everyone else as well.
Thank you for having me on, Chantal. Thank you. Awesome.
Oh, that was